Yeah. I haven't set it up yet. That will happen in just a moment. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Get Feb. Sorry, I have to do this.
Sorry.
It's all right. There we go. This talk will probably end up going on the public channel, which means that it can be searched for and found by anybody, which is good news. For those in the room, usual bits for housekeeping. Obviously, we're on the top floor here, and I can't wait for the fact that soon the night's going to start to get a bit shorter, and we'll be able to see a bit more from the windows, even if it is raining. Maybe if we get good weather in a couple of months, we'll be outside on the balcony beforehand, sipping wine, enjoying the view across Oxford. But if there is a fire alarm, then there are two exits. Obviously, the main stairs that some people came up, and then the back stairs down there, just all the way to the bottom, out into the car park, and gather round on the front side near the door, but opposite the door, not near it, so away from the building. And we'll just do a head count, and then I'll know if we've got everybody out. When you're leaving today, those in the room, please do not press 0, even though it has a green button around it, because that will take you to the basement where they load deliveries. So it's floor 1 you want to get out of this beautiful building, or indeed downstairs. And also for anyone who's new, the toilets are just across the hallway on the right. So I'm very delighted today to introduce Dr. Tundi Agardy. So I love the fact that your middle name is Spring, isn't it? I think given that, it would have to be either meteorology or biology. But anyway, settled on biology when she was a student at Wellesley and Dartmouth with a particular interest in marine biology, and then moved into doing her doctorate in sea turtle populations and genetics at the University of Rhode Island a bit later. Our speaker tonight has been a Marine Policy Fellow at Woods Hole and worked for the World Wildlife Fund, for UNESCO, for various conservation organisations, including Conservation International, and clearly thought that it was a good idea to found her own, which is called Sound Seas, a lovely name. She's also Science and Policy Director at the World Ocean Observatory, and she's won numerous awards for making a difference to seas and oceans around the world, including the Civic Scientist of the Year from Earthwatch in 1998. We're very lucky to grab her because she's only here for a term. She's a distinguished visiting fellow at Worcester College, Oxford. And I'm very, very pleased to have this kind of opportunity to look at this type of subject, which we don't manage to talk about very often. Dr. Tundi Agardy.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you, and I love the format of this kind of a Café Scientifique. It really lends itself to thinking a little bit outside the box, and for all of you to get exposed to something that you might not have been exposed to being here in Oxford. What I want to talk to you about today is, and I'll be brief because I want to engage you as much as possible, is talk about the state of the global ocean and the values that oceans provide humanity and the extent to which human life and actually all of the life on the planet depend on a healthy ocean. But I don't want to fill you with dread and doom and gloom because I really want to focus on the opportunities for restoring the damage that we've done and finding ways to reconnect with nature and also have oceans continue to deliver benefits to humanity and to the rest of the life on the planet. And before I start, though, I'd like to task you with a little something, and people online as well. And if you would indulge me, I'd like it if you would just write down on the slip of paper that's in front of you your own thoughts. Maybe I turn this off, I don't know. Rachel, is there a way that I can check if it's on?
Just wait up again.
It worked before.
It did.
Yeah. I might have to advance with the...
I'm just trying to...
Sorry.
There you go.
I know why. There we go. Go for
Good.
it.
Okay, let's put it back. Sorry.
It should work with that now.
Oh, it'll work now? Okay. So what I'd like you to do is to just jot down in 1 or 2 words, not sentence, not paragraph, just 1 or 2 words what the ocean means to you or what the ocean does for you. And it's fine if you can't think of anything, that's okay too. And if you think the ocean does nothing for you, please write that down.
And if people online can also do it, we're going to build everything together if we can. So
Yeah.
if people online could do the same, that would be really appreciated.
I do trust that you
It's
have
into
good
the
enough
chat.
memory to remember what you were thinking about, because I'm going to pose this question at the end again. But the reason for writing it down is because we want to play a little bit with generating word clouds and seeing kind of what kind of consensus we might have in the audience about what the ocean means to them, to people here. All set? And again, I'm sorry to put the pressure on you. Okay, good. So let's go on. Oceans means many things to many different people. I've had the fantastic opportunity, I've been very lucky in my lifetime to work in a lot of different parts of the world with a lot of different kinds of people who either have a strong dependency on the ocean, who happen to live near the ocean, who work in maritime industries, who study the ocean. But one of the first things that we learn as marine conservationists, people working to protect the ocean, is that there are a lot of different perspectives on the ocean values, what the ocean means to people. For many people, the ocean is a place of awe and wonder, of massive amounts of biodiversity and wonderful megafauna like whales and sea turtles. For other people, it's a very convenient way to transport goods, and it's a place of heavy industry. The oceans do a lot in terms of ridding our wastes. So we have a lot of urban centers and ports built up all around the world that take advantage of these values that the ocean provides. One of the most important connections that people have to the ocean, though, is in smaller communities of fishers or other people that utilize oceans and coasts. And these communities are often the most marginalized communities in many countries. So they're often people from different ethnicities than political leaders. They're often marginalized because they have high levels of poverty. And they're often squeezed out by large industry players that come in to utilize ocean space and ocean resources. So again, oceans mean many things to many people. I was fortunate enough to be involved in the first ever global assessment of ecosystems called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. It was done in the early 2000s and published in 2005. And in that Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, it was very interesting because I was involved with the early pilot study that scoped out what we could say, how we could actually measure the condition of different ecosystems and how actually we would divide up the world into different ecosystems to be able to assess them. And that early pilot study really kind of just ignored the ocean. 70% of the world's surface is ocean, and a lot of the coastal areas are the most important ecological places on Earth. Yet, for many, many centuries, we have ignored the importance of oceans in terms of planetary processes, in terms of supporting human beings. And it's understandable because human beings are terrestrial creatures. Many human beings fear the ocean for good reason. The ocean can be a violent, dangerous place. And we're not comfortable in the ocean. Many of us are comfortable, but in general, humans are, being terrestrial people, terrestrial beings are not that comfortable in the ocean. And Studying the ocean is very expensive as well. So we suffer from a lack of knowledge, sometimes a lack of interest, and even in a very thorough, systematic assessment of the world's ecosystems, the oceans were kind of marginalized in the beginning. We then, when we set out to do the Millennium Assessment, we focused on dividing up the global ocean into two parts. One, the coastal ocean, and I was able to kind of shepherd the scientists involved with that assessment. And the other part was the open ocean, which are largely fishery systems that we were looking at. So in the coastal ocean, a place of a number of different ecological processes delivering different values of use to humans or of value to humans. And we call these ecosystem services. They range from everything from being places that provide nursery habitat for a lot of the species that we harvest to eat, so fisheries species, even species that live far out at sea. Many of the young come into coastal areas to grow and sometimes to reproduce. So in addition, the oceans, of course, provide important recreational services and cultural services. People all over the place go to the beach, go diving, go swimming. Coastal tourism is the largest segment of tourism worldwide, so very important economic engine, and also very important for people's well-being, emotional well-being, and physical health as well. Estuaries are also a place, particularly estuaries, but also coastal wetlands that filter pollutants. So this role of kind of waste management and dealing with waste coming down from rivers and also dealing from waste in situ is something that coastal ecosystems provide. And the healthier the ecosystem, the more waste is processed and managed for us. Let's see. Reefs are very important, and reefs of all types, not just coast. I work primarily in the tropics, so I work primarily with coral reefs, but reefs of all kinds, including oyster reefs and other shellfish reefs, rock reefs also, that are covered with a huge number of encrusting species. These living barriers protect coastal land and infrastructure. And it's really important to think about how they protect coastal land and infrastructure, because unlike human-built infrastructure, like breakwaters, jetties, and revetments and things like that, these living systems can adapt to sea level rise. And so they can grow and continue to buffer land from storms, from waves, from even tsunamis, to keep pace with the rising seas and continue to do that. Whereas, of course, built infrastructure, you'd have to go back and keep adding, keep building. Of course, we can't forget one of the most important sectors in the coastal area is fisheries, but not just fisheries to support all of us who live in urban environments or semi-urban environments and can access fish products in a Sainsbury's or a Tesco, but also very importantly for local people. So these coastal fisheries are very, very important in terms of food security in much of the world. About 70% of small marginalized coastal communities rely on ocean resources primarily for their protein. So very, very important. There's been a lot of focus lately on another things that coasts do for us, coasts and oceans, which is something called blue carbon, which is sequestering carbon, taking it out of the atmosphere and mitigating the effect of climate change by doing that, taking it out of the atmosphere, fixing it, and sequestering it into soils below, sediments below the water. And it's remarkable the rate at which some of these ecosystems sequester carbon. far exceeding things like tropical forests, in fact. So mangrove forests, which are fringe forests of trees that are tolerant to salt, so they can live in salty, brackish water, or even marine waters. Seagrasses, which are the only flowering plant in the ocean. It lives on the bottom and forms great big meadows, both in the tropics and in the temperate areas here all around the UK, are vast amounts of seagrass. Not as vast as there once was. About 70% of seagrass around the island has been lost in the last about 50 years. So unfortunately, seagrass is declining, but seagrass is another carbon sequestering habitat. Salt marsh is another one that sequesters carbon very, very effectively. And there are other bizarre things. One thing, I worked in Abu Dhabi on a blue carbon project, and one of the habitat types that sequestered at the highest rate, surprisingly, were cyanobacterial mats. These are blue-green algae mats that live in the intertidal. And most people, if you've ever seen, have any of you ever seen a blue-green algae mat? It's kind of smelly, and people want to rid these things, get rid of the blue-green algae. But very important, actually, habitat. Sequesters carbon, but also very important for disease control in the coastal system. So really bizarre kind of habitat. Anyway, mostly mangroves, salt marsh, and seagrass have been the focus of a lot of people thinking, if only we can increase the carbon sequestration that happens in these places, we can mitigate climate change. And in fact, many entrepreneurs are trying to run around the world and buy up areas that contain these habitats so they can sell the blue carbon credits in the environmental market, in the carbon market. So this has been getting a lot of attention. I'm just going to say something provocative here, which is, and I go against many of my colleagues when I say this, and in fact I ran for a while a program for a group called Forest Trends, which was looking at blue carbon and trying to get many of these projects in the pipeline as possible because there was a lot of interest in investing in blue carbon. The problem that is happening now, though, is there's been such a focus on climate change and such a focus on blue carbon mitigating climate change that people around the world are incentivized to think only about this ecosystem service coming out of these habitats and transforming these habitats into super carbon sequestration habitats at the expense of other things. So we have, for instance, in Abu Dhabi, a place with very limited mangrove. It's a place with very limited surface water reaching the shore, so you don't have the vast mangrove stands that you have in Central Africa or in Asia. But in Abu Dhabi, they have been planting mangroves for probably 6 decades now. And they are planting mangroves in such a way that they sometimes do land reclamation to create the plot where they put in the mangroves, and they plant them one species of mangrove every meter. All mangroves are the same size. In some places, they don't even have access to the ocean, so the mangroves can't possibly do the role of providing fish nursery habitat or filtering pollutants from the water or so forth. So, but those mangroves are valued because they're sequestering carbon. So just a little provocative note that it's never good to focus only on one thing that one value that these systems are providing and try to maximize that value at the expense of everything else. So it's not just all of these values that I mentioned, fisheries and recreational values and carbon sequestration, waste management and so forth. It's also the fact that the ocean is actually supporting life on the planet. Every second breath that you take is oxygen derived from marine plants. So if we create a situation where the oceans are of ill health, declining in health, and phytoplankton production is compromised, we start to undermine our life support system on the planet. And of course, oceans play a lot of other regulatory and supporting roles, including in maintaining the climate, in nutrient flows, and so forth. So our life really does depend on healthy oceans, beyond all these other industries and ways that we extract value from the ocean. Unfortunately, and I promise now I'm going to stop after this slide, well, a couple of slides. I'm going to stop talking about the bad news and start talking about the good news. But right now we're in this kind of negative feedback loop, and it's very hard to break this cycle. What's happening is that we have a lot of habitat destruction, primarily in coastal lands, and in coastal waters to some extent, but primarily in the coastal zone on land. That habitat destruction and degradation is starting to have a cascading effect on different marine systems. So we start to see when we develop, we have poor development in the coastal zone, we take away mangroves or salt marsh or other kinds of important habitats here. That has an effect on linked habitats like seagrass meadows, which is why I think you've seen in the UK such a massive loss of seagrass. And not because people are tearing up the seagrass and taking it out or harvesting it or anything. It's because of all these impacts on land and in fresh water coming into the ocean. This loss of seagrass and other kinds of habitat, the degradation of these nearshore marine habitats, means a decrease in fisheries. It means a decrease in recreational opportunities, a decline in tourism and tourism revenue. That is all affecting the ability of ecosystems to do things like buffer land from storms and keep pace with sea level rise. And all of this is contributing to declining human well-being, especially in these communities that are highly dependent on coastal areas. And that in turn is driving more and more conflict and more habitat destruction. So people are desperate and they're trying to find ways to live and to, rise up out of poverty. Yeah, no, I don't know if you're going to tell me to cut it off now. Okay. And I just want to make a point, and then I promise I'll get to the good news, that the oceans are suffering a death of 1,000 cuts. So it's not generally, I think in the terrestrial environment, if we take a tropical forest or a grasslands, usually there are only a few pressures acting simultaneously in the place. And you can describe and understand the pressures and take steps to abate them. In the sea, we have a lot of pressures acting simultaneously. Sometimes these pressures are far away from the ocean, way up in watersheds. The diversion of fresh water, for instance, from estuaries, is causing a huge problem with the ocean. The clear cutting of forests, sometimes far again from the coast, is causing sedimentation into rivers and pollution into rivers, which then flows downstream. Agriculture, without using things like riparian buffers or without limiting pesticide use and fertilizer use, is causing dead zones in many of the world's seas, these areas of low oxygen and where nothing essentially can live. And add to that all of our harvest, which is sometimes unsustainable, not just of living resources, but also mining. So we have a lot of phosphate mining in the sea and in coastal lands. We have, of course, fossil fuel extraction, and then we have a lot of fisheries overexploitation going on also by big industrial players that come into conflict with small-scale fishers who are trying to feed themselves and their families. On top of it all, we have climate change, and climate change is impacting the ability of all these systems to work. We have warming waters, which is causing shifts in species distributions. It's causing declines in productivity in some places. It's causing the spread of disease in some places. We also have the threat. I don't know if you've read it in the paper in the last couple of days, but it's been very highlighted, this new report that came out about the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Ocean Current, which it drives, it's like the ocean conveyor belt, driving cold polar water down towards the tropics, and that water comes up from deep, very highly nutrified water, comes up in upwelling areas all around the world. You've heard of upwelling, that's where most of our very large-scale fisheries take place. And there is some thought that there's actual fact that current is slowing down, and there's some models that suggest it's going to shut down sometime in the future, unless we curb carbon emissions. And on top of that, we also have ocean acidification, which means that the oceans, which are relatively basic, are becoming more acidic. And that means that animals, especially at the base of the food chain, that have calcareous skeletons and shells, are unable to make those shells, and it's kind of tearing a hole in the bottom of the food web. So these impacts are on top of all the other impacts, and it's kind of the background noise, and it means that we have the imperative right now to deal with all these things that we can deal with, because we cannot stop right now warming that's happening. We can certainly slow it down if we would only commit to that. And if we would start to curb our consumption and start to really have countries follow their, walk the talk and actually take steps to curb emissions, we could slow climate change down, but we can't immediately stop it. What we can do, though, is deal with all the other pressures that I mentioned, because healthier ecosystems are going to be able to cope with these climate change-induced changes. Sick ecosystems will not be able to do that. So we need to restore the health of these systems. I'm not gonna keep going with the bad news, but it's multiple cumulative impacts, but we know the solution to a lot of these problems, and we have studied coastal areas particularly well enough to know how to practice triage, what to do first, what are the most important areas to protect and restore, and so forth. Now, just another note is that the global ocean is a very big place. As I said, it's 71% of the Earth's surface. And you would think that the oceans are so big that nothing that humans could do would ever impact this massive, complex, interacting system. But it's the coasts which are the most important, and the coasts which are the most impacted by humans. So this happens to be up in Scotland. It's a beautiful scene, devoid of humans and impact. But it is these coastal areas, particularly where fresh water meets the sea, that are the vital organs of the marine system, like the heart, lungs, and liver of the marine system. And it is these places that are most impacted. Picture this. We have about 42% of the global population living in the coastal zone today. And that coastal zone is only 5% of the Earth's inhabitable land. It's also so we have these people packed into this tiny little strip of land all over the continents. And this is the place where population doubling rate is the highest. So huge density of people, huge population increases, not just because people are reproducing, but also because there's a lot of in-migration to the coasts. As we degrade inland areas, and this is particularly true in Africa, people are essentially environmental refugees, and they're moving to the coast, and they're starting to engage in fisheries and other activities that that is not a part of their culture, that they don't know how to do. There's a lot of issues with safety and with social breakdown and so forth. But it's this that we have to focus on. The nearshore coastal areas, particularly the estuaries around the world that are so important. So I can see everybody's face is glum and the corners of your mouth are torn down, so I'm going to stop. I'm not going to go into the risks of not doing this. I want to focus on the positive because I am convinced, even despite what we know, and we know more and more each day, I am convinced that we can do this. And what I'm doing here at Oxford with my fellowship is working with a woman named Lisa Wedding, who works in the geography department. And we are pulling together a special issue of a journal, a nature journal called Ocean Sustainability, to showcase large-scale multi-habitat restoration projects all around the world, to show that we can in fact do this, that we're able to do this and we're seeing good results, and we just need the will to do more of this and bring more of these small-scale restoration projects to scale. So in order to do this, we really need to value conservation, so environmental protection and restoration. We really need to not think of that as a sector, not think of that as one use of the marine and coastal environment. And unfortunately, right now, policymakers are thinking about conservation and about restoration as a special interest. Oh, you know, we'll take those environmentalists and we'll throw them a bone. We'll give them this little spot somewhere that nobody uses. And they can put a marine park around that and they can say that they're doing conservation. No, what we need to do is we need to think about what we need to protect and restore these marine areas in everything that we do going forward, in terms of new development, in terms of new expanding maritime industries, in terms of what we do as individuals when we visit these places or when we consume resources from these places. So individual choice too. We have to put restoration really at the front and center. We have to think of a full range of values that our oceans provide and not focus on maximizing one. You've already heard that from me. We have to work in interdisciplinary ways, which is something that Oxford excels at and is leading the way. But harnessing the social science is as important as understanding the biogeography, the ecology of these places, understanding the impacts on the natural environment. Harnessing the social science to understand people's perceptions, which is why I asked you the question in the beginning, and how we can reach people to affect change is super important. I often talk about kind of conservation versus going for blue growth. Blue growth is where countries decide that, oh, they're coastal countries, they have a lot of resources, they have a lot of space, they could gain a lot of, you know, GDP from exploiting resources in space. So there's a lot of planning right now focused on how to grow the blue economy, or blue growth. And most of that is really focused on trying to reduce conflicts among users that currently exist, particularly the big players. So how do you put an oil rig here and allow fishing here, big industrial scale fishing here, and still have your shipping channel, you know, transversing the area or whatever. So it's kind of dealing with the status quo and trying to reduce conflict between big industrial players. That's my kind of facetious take on it. There's a very human-centric way of looking at ocean and looking at planning, how you harness forward-thinking planners to come up with plans for management of the ocean. But meanwhile, the conservationists are kind of working on the other extreme, which is kind of a nature-centric approach, often without thinking about human needs or human well-being, often without engaging social scientists sufficiently, and often creating conflicts of their own by taking areas and fencing them off and saying, this is going to be a no-take area, no, you can't fish there. This is important to protect. I mean, it has a lot of species that we value, we, the conservation scientists. So we're going to take away your use of this place so we can give it back to nature. Somewhere is a happy medium between these two extremes. Somewhere we can think about developing, but by developing, also thinking about what steps we need to take to not only make the development sustainable and low impact, but to restore at the same time. To take the proceeds from blue growth, from the blue economy, and invest it in fixing the health of the ocean. Because that way, the ocean will keep giving back forever. Now, otherwise, it won't. That's the only way we can get to the point where we break this cycle and we turn it on its head, and it becomes a positive cycle. It becomes a positive cycle where you have investment in habitat restoration, not just on land, but in the water. And we know how to do this. And there's great examples from all over the world. I'm happy to discuss some of them in the Q&A or in a discussion with you. The protection and restoration of habitat that increases the flow of benefits, it increases human well-being, it reduces conflict, and it spurs even more investment in the future. So that's my hopeful note, and I am not really, I have to defend myself and say I'm not Pollyannish about this, because there are real examples of this all around the world where countries are doing this, where communities are doing this, where non-governmental agencies, organizations are doing this. So it is possible, and it's really an exciting time to be seeing this kind of shift in thinking away from purely protecting what we have left and thinking about restoring the health of the ocean. So what I like to do, actually, before I take questions or before we have an open discussion, is I'd like you just to reflect for a minute and put down on paper, again, 1 or 2 words on what the ocean means to you now, if it's changed at all. I know. Or maybe 1 or 2 words on how you might think differently if you do.
And again, if people online can push into the chat, can you just say new discussion in the chat? We'll put these up there as well. Give everyone a couple of minutes just to do that. We'll collect them at the end of the break.
Is it okay if I sit down?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Good. My other one isn't working.
So before we go to questions, can I just ask anyone to volunteer if they have anything to say about kind of their before and after words?
People are being shy. I
Don't
think
be
they
shy.
might still be thinking, we'll come back to that. We're going to take a proper break.
Okay.
So that lets people in the room refill their glasses and get more snacks.
Oh, good.
So we'll just
I love
take a
this
5
format.
minutes.
This is
Yeah.
great, yeah.
And so until the end of the break, if anybody online wants to put more comments in, if anything's changed about how they see seas and oceans now, that would be interesting to do. We're going to do 2 word clouds and look at them right at the very end,
Yeah,
if
great.
that's all right.
Good.
In the meantime, can we say thank you to our speaker? So we'll do our discussion the way we normally do, which is if you're in the room, if you can just wait till I get to you with a microphone, it means that not only can everybody in here hear, whichever way they're facing, but also that the people online can as well, because they'll be hearing it through the speaker. Okay? So if you wouldn't mind just waiting for that, that'd be good. Then people on the chat, keep putting things into the chat, whether it's your words about the ocean or whether it's the comments and discussion points and questions you have. But before we do that, I'm going to ask Tundi just to give us an example of a project she feels is doing it right. So where some of these things are working, just to cheer us up, I think, and make it a bit more concrete.
And I apologize because I can see that kind of a firm grounding in a concrete example would be helpful, and I didn't bring, I didn't put it in the slides, so so I'll talk about a project in Antalya, Turkey, which is a restoration project, very, very large-scale restoration project funded by the Endangered Landscapes Program right out of Cambridge. This project started many years ago as a small-scale conservation project, engaging local fishermen. I don't know if you know where Antalya is. I feel strange without a map, but it's kind of the western part of Turkey facing south, but right on the corner facing Greece. And years ago, the local environmental group called AKD worked with local fishermen to set up a voluntary no-take area in a big, very huge, actually, bay that was heavily fished. One of the most important places in terms of estuaries, there's several estuaries lining this bay, so critically important place. So it started with this kind of traditional conservation thing, community-based though, people volunteering to not fish in a certain area, and the group very intelligently said, it's not enough that we ask these fishers to move farther offshore or to different places to fish. We need to think about how to compensate them, but not financially, but compensate them in such a way that it doesn't impact their livelihood, but also that they get engaged with the recovery that happens when you have this kind of closure. So they started working, understanding, and this is where the social science comes in, understanding how these fishing communities were structured, to what extent people were reliant on fisheries versus on tourism. It's a very important tourist area also. To what extent people had kind of multiple livelihoods, sometimes fishing, sometimes taking tourists around and so forth, or cooking, or doing other things in the tourist sector. So they did a lot of engagement with the community and a lot of studies. Sorry, this thing is bothering me. Maybe I'll take it out of my pocket. And what they came to then do is develop a strategic plan for restoring not the areas beyond this bay, but in subsequent areas down to the east. So more and more of the coastline of Antalya. So they're doing active restoration now with the fishermen. One of the things is that this area has seen a lot of invasive species come in. Species come in from the Indian Ocean through the Suez Canal, and they travel up the Levant, the eastern portion of the Mediterranean, and end up in Turkey. Sometimes they travel further and end up in the Adriatic or in the northwestern part of the Mediterranean. But there's a lot of invasive species, particularly fish species, in Turkey. So this group started working with the fishermen to train them on how to catch these invasive species, and started working with chefs and restaurants on how to cook these invasive species. So basically created a market for these invasive species. These species were wreaking havoc because one of them, the rabbitfish, is a very voracious grazer, and grazing down on algae that's very important for the ecosystem. So there's been this mass movement to catch this fish, to make it from an invasive nuisance into a valuable commodity. But also the group started working with the fishers to introduce refrigeration, to work with the women fish processors, to give them better facilities for processing the fish. So all of this kind of development work alongside the conservation. The kinds of active restoration they're doing is pretty interesting. It ranges from everything from like really splashy, exciting stuff like actually rebuilding monk seal caves so that they can be inhabited by monk seals that go into these caves to pup. Monk seal is a critically endangered seal in the Mediterranean, which is now slowly coming back. Population is rebounding. But it's very limited by how many caves it can find. It's a very nervous animal, and it won't give birth to its pups in a place with humans. So these isolated caves in Turkey are really important for supporting the population. And many of them have, because of sea level rise actually, or because of other destruction, mudslides and rock slides and so forth, these caves are suitable for monk seals. So they actually physically rebuild these caves so they have a dry land area inside the cave. So the outside of the cave is not visible to anybody, so tourists don't go in there. And they install cameras so that they have round-the-clock surveillance of the monk seals, know how the monk seals are doing, and know if they're pupping. That's kind of exciting and a kind of a fringe element of this project. More importantly, they're doing a lot of work in physically restoring the salt marsh. So planting salt marsh grasses, restoring the natural flows of streams through the salt marsh instead of the channels that were once built. And so that kind of restoration, doing experiments to remove things like long sea urchin that's come in from the Indian Ocean. And let's see, what else? Doing things to actively restore habitat for a shark species that's almost disappeared from that part of the Mediterranean and is now coming back. So there's a whole suite of activities, all planned very strategically, but all planned with local communities and supported by local communities. And people derive both satisfaction and revenue from these projects. So they're highly supported, as does the government, which is very happy to be seeing Turkey profiled in this way. It's one of the pioneering restoration projects in the world, and the person who heads up this project received the Goldman Award, the kind of the Nobel Prize for environmental work this past year. So it's a really exciting project. I'm sorry I don't have slides to show you.
That's okay. Some people on the chat saying thank you very much for explaining that.
Good.
So catch my eye if there's anything particular you want to say or put in. Lovely.
Yes, thank you very much. An excellent talk, and it's really made me think. I think one of the things that it sort of made me think is that you're right, and that's the way it's going to go, and obviously a delay, but almost independent of what the delay is, it's sort of got to be obvious at some point that this is done, and therefore you've got all these coastal places that are being run right down now at the moment. So this is the time to buy them, because it can be like London Docklands, you know, it's sort of like, you know, these are all going to be fantastic places in the future, worth much, much more than they are now, just at all around the coastal areas. Is that a fair summing up?
Well, I think it is true that coastal lands are exceedingly valuable. And are exceedingly, particularly in the developed world, are exceedingly out of reach for most people, because these expensive lands are bought up by very wealthy people who often limit the access. But that's not the case in a lot of the developing world still. And what we see is a lot of governments taking interest in what we call nature-based solutions, NBS. So investing, working with landowners, or in some cases buying out landowners to maximize the ecological health of these habitats, and to, in many cases, restore habitat that was lost by developers. So while it is true that there is a lot of speculative investing going on and people trying to think about a future, people are also thinking about what's going to happen with sea level rise, and what the extent to which this rush to privatize the shoreline and to deny access for people. I think that's being a little bit inhibited now by people's realization that the sea levels are rising in many places, storm intensity is increasing, and maybe that investment is a dangerous investment for people who fancy a very fancy estate on the water, or a resort,
Excuse me, thank you. One from online. Is the role of the ocean as a carbon and heat sink well understood? And I was thinking along similar lines when you first started your talk about how James Lovelock picked up the idea of the ocean as being the thing that connects everything together on the planet. Could you say a little bit about that? How much do we really know about how those two work?
Yeah, I mean, we have great advances with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has been looking at the oceans from the standpoint of how it regulates the global climate, but in so doing has also better understood all of the other things that the oceans do, and the connections between oceans and land and atmosphere and fresh water. So I was just talking about the Gaia hypothesis to a colleague here in Oxford, and asking whether it was still a supported idea. And I think the idea has matured, and become more, maybe more complex than the way it was described by James Lovelock. But we certainly know a lot. What we don't know, I mean, there are a lot of, on the biodiversity front, we have vast parts of the ocean that we don't understand. We don't know what's living there. We don't understand what the base of life is for, things like hydrothermal vents. It's not a sun-based photosynthesis-based system. It's a chemosynthesis-based system, so completely strange to us. But those hydrothermal vents are only one kind of system in the deep sea, and there may be many, many others. There's a lot of interest right now in mesophotic areas, which are the middle dark waters beyond where the light reaches, but not the seafloor, because the seafloor we know a bit about, but this part of the water column turns out to be super interesting and surprising. So given that, and to answer your question, I am getting there, because the biota have so much to do with these processes, these larger processes and feedback loops. We do have gaps in our knowledge, but I think, understand every time we learn something, it's about how much more important the ocean was to all these planetary processes than we thought. So we're
Thank
still
you very much.
learning.
Anybody else in the room? Okay.
What you were just mentioning just now, most of your talk was about coastal areas, but you began talking about the deep ocean. Lots of questions about that, but what's the relative importance is in considering coastal areas and what's happening in the deep ocean? And in a particular instance that's been hitting the news a lot recently is the rush to deep ocean mining, where it looks like people might be treading an area they don't know very much about.
Right.
What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so with the caveat that I'm not an oceanographer, I'm a marine biologist and I work in coastal areas, so that's my cognitive bias. But also I focus the talk on coastal areas because that's, number one, the place where restoration is most needed, so it's the places that we've mucked up the most. And secondarily, because the coastal areas are so important for a lot of these ecological functions. But for sure, the deep sea is very important. And there is I didn't say anything about the kind of policy enabling environment, which is also a reason that I'm optimistic and why I think it's a really exciting time to be alive and to be working in this field. There's a number of international treaties that have just come into play. One is the Convention on Biological Diversity, negotiated in 2022, a set of targets that virtually all countries in the world have committed to restore 30% of their land and sea area by 2030. Now that is not an attainable goal. Right now we're about at less than 1% in terms of restoration. We need to come to scale, and we are scaling up, but in the 5.5 years remaining until people start taking stock of where we are in 2030, we're not going to get to 30%. But in any way, there is a commitment of countries to move in that direction, which is good. But to your point, there's also a UN agreement in the General Assembly to agree to protect the areas beyond national jurisdiction. These are the high seas. The treaty is called the BB&J Agreement for Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, BB&J. And most countries in the world have signed on to the BB&J agreement. It was a terrible, long negotiation, took years and years, and it looked like it was going to fail at every step. Every negotiation ended in disagreement, but miraculously, last year, they did agree to standards, to a system of monitoring, talked about compliance mechanisms, talked about the need to set up protected areas, talked about the need to better understand systems before large-scale industrial activities would be permitted. So to do environmental impact assessments and strategic environmental assessments like we do in coastal areas in most jurisdictions around the world. So there is goodwill and there is the commitment to protect the high seas. Unfortunately, and I'm going to get in trouble for this probably, unfortunately, just last week, Norway announced that it was going ahead with deep seabed mining, despite the fact that the world has coalesced around the idea that there should be a moratorium on deep seabed mining until we know more and until we can effectively assess what this mining is going to do to both to biodiversity and to many of these important processes going on. Norway has decided to go it alone and against the global community. So that is unfortunate, but they're getting a lot of pushback. So we'll see. Unfortunately, this seabed does contain a lot of strategic minerals, especially the ones that we need for renewable energy to combat the climate change crisis. So, you know, these heavy metals and rare earth minerals, they do exist on the seabed, so it's going to be an interesting time to see if conservation and restoration can hold some of these destructive impacts at bay.
Slightly scary, I think. Slightly scary. That echoed a question online as well. The same person who was asking about subsea mining, so you've answered that, also made a comment which will, I'm sure, resonate with some. From a UK perspective, seas and oceans have played a vital role in keeping various invaders, such as Hitler and Napoleon, at bay. Just a fair point, I think.
An invasive species.
Yeah, exactly. Invasive species, I like that. Question here asking, what is the effect of increased sewage deposition, presumably linked to higher populations? And I mean, I'm very aware we're living right now in a city that is one of the most distant from the coasts of Britain, although be it not far in relative terms compared with most countries. And, you know, our sewage goes downstream, and yeah, what is the effect of that generally around the planet?
Yeah, that's a really important point. I mean, we think about Oxford and not as a coastal place, but it is, I mean, like everything else on the Thames is contributing to the condition of the estuary and the near shore waters of the North Sea. So sewage, I mean, I've been a little alarmed at the attention that climate change is getting and fisheries are getting in the ocean debate, because we seem to be ignoring pollution. It's a really difficult thing to deal with. It's not a sexy topic. It doesn't attract a lot of donor interest. You know, many groups don't get involved with pollution control for that reason, because it's not financially viable for them to work on the issue. Also, it involves stakeholders and, you know, affected and affecting parties far, far away, and it's a very diffuse problem. I was involved with just the writing. I had nothing to do with any research, but I was involved with the writing of the synthesis report for OSPAR, which is the treaty agreement for the Northeast Atlantic. So it includes, of course, the UK and Ireland and Scandinavia and France and Belgium and Spain and Portugal and so forth. All the countries in the OSPAR region have committed to really good monitoring of eutrophication. Eutrophication is what the phenomenon when you over-fertilize waters with sewage or with animal waste or with fertilizers. It's called eutrophication because you're passing a threshold for a normal level of nutrients, and you're spurring all kinds of growth of phytoplankton, which eventually die and lead to fish kills, robbing the oxygen of the water of oxygen, creating dead zones in the extreme case. So eutrophication is a huge problem in the Northeast Atlantic. I don't know if I think the question was referring to the UK, right? And again, you know, how much of that is from, I mean, for sure with your rivers, sewage is a major problem, and the water companies need to deal with that. But in terms of the bigger picture and thinking globally, sewage is a small part of the pollution load, and agriculture is a very, very large part of the pollution load. And so when we think about sustainable agriculture, we need to think about not just what we're doing on the fields and on the farms, but also the effect of agriculture downstream and in the ocean. And then the other scary thing is not only nutrients going in, but you know, all kinds of toxins. And many of these toxins have a very, very long half-life. So these things are going to be in these systems for a long time. And is again difficult to control. There's a lot of big players who, you know, don't want to limit their use of these chemicals. But this is something that we really need to nip in the bud, because, yeah.
Thank you very much. Couple more. One very quick one. To what extent or distance does ocean salt water percolate down into the seabeds or coastal land areas? So is it salty meters down or hundreds of meters, or is it kilometers?
Oh, I have no idea. I'd love to know the answer to that. Somebody online or somebody in the room, maybe.
Presumably there must be a point at which you can get freshwater springs near the coast.
Oh yeah, there are freshwater springs near the coast, and there's also actually a phenomenon that we deal with a lot in coral reefs where, for instance, I do a lot of work in Barbados, and in Barbados there's a very interesting pattern of coral degradation that doesn't relate to what's going on the coast so much, and it was very interesting to observe. And it turns out that there's a lot of fresh water from the aquifer coming out under the coastal area and coming up out on these distant coral reefs. And because the aquifer is polluted, those coral reefs are becoming degraded, and in some cases you see signals of sewage actually, and disease related to sewage. So, but the question about the freshwater and how far the salt, one of the phenomenon that's going on that I didn't mention because I didn't want to, there's a lot of things going on that aren't good, but because we're drawing down aquifers, we're causing the salinization of a lot of coastal freshwaters. So
And that's happening in London particularly. Their aquifer is being drained, yeah.
really?
It's a big supply of fresh water to London. It's running down.
And is it getting salty?
I don't know. Good question.
Because
Yeah.
it's happening with agricultural land. So as agriculture pulls more water out for irrigation, that aquifer is getting salty, and then the agriculture doesn't work because plants don't like salt water.
I'm starting to think after this, when I put the video up, we should all send a link to our local MPs. Be good.
Yeah,
Good for them to know about. I have one question for me, which is, you mentioned right at the beginning you were talking about blue-green algae. Just kind of in a nutshell, you mentioned that they help control disease. Are you talking about disease of wildlife in the sea or disease generally?
No, disease. So this is a new area of study and very nascent. And it's disease within the intertidal community, so not human disease. But it's very strange because many cyanobacteria are highly toxic and are considered to be lethal to a lot of biota. And on the other hand, when you remove these cyanobacterial mats, what you see is, for some reason, the cyanobacteria actually suppress a lot of these pathogens. And so when you take them away, then the pathogens are released into the intertidal and cause disease.
But then, of course, that can affect humans because it can affect food chains and sustainability of industry around there. Yeah,
definitely.
On a kind of similar note, got a question here asking, what impact, if any, do fish farms have on the ocean environment generally?
Yeah, and before I answer that question, just to complete a thought in my head about why restoring habitats can actually be very important for the fisheries industry and for people seeking to make money or livelihoods from the sea. One of the reasons is not just because a fish nursery habitat will increase fisheries productivity, so you have more fish to catch, but also because the quality of fish is better. So these habitats that pull pesticides, heavy metals out of the water, or even pathogens, and sequester those in the habitat so they don't get into the food chain, mean that you have healthier fish product, and that leads to better human health outcomes, public health outcomes. Sorry, so you were asking me...
Effect of fish farms on oceans.
Yes, yeah, fish farms.
I guess they're probably asking really big industry versions, such as those you were mentioning.
Yeah, I mean, the aquaculture industry runs the gamut from big industrial, very impactful, very unsustainable kinds of operations in which, first of all, growing fish that are carnivores, like salmon, makes no sense and is unsustainable currently because the fish that are caught to feed those salmon are being overfished. So we have what we call forage fish, prey fish species out in the wild. These are harvested in huge numbers so that you can feed salmon in pens. But there's also the issue of waste from pens, of fish farming operations. For instance, we have in Pacific North America Atlantic salmon being grown in pens and then are accidentally escape and cause all kinds of problems to the native Pacific salmon population. So There are those bad examples, but more and more aquaculture is being designed in a sustainable way, and in particular, the really exciting thing are these 3D fish farming operations. They call them 3D, three-dimensional fish farming, where you're culturing a lot of different things at once that all interplay. So you have shellfish production, you can have finfish production, and you can have macroalgae, so you can be growing seaweeds. And the seaweeds can act to filter the water of pollutants and keep your fisheries product healthier and higher quality. Or you can grow in a more pristine environment, you can grow the algae for food and for thickener and all kinds of things that they do with algae, macroalgae, seaweeds. But then you also have shellfish and you have fish, and in this system they all kind of interact, almost like a mesocosm experiment, and all these positive feedbacks and these very high valued products come out of this kind of aquaculture. So it is financially, economically sustainable and viable, as well as being ecologically low impact. So.
Right, so my passion is AI, so I'm wondering how AI gets used. Now I can see it's used for modelling, for this is what's going to happen in the world. So I've just dreamed up another application for it, of thinking that if we go on like we're going, then in 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years time, it's going to sort of like, ecology is going to keep up. And so we can model how that's going to keep up, and so you can imagine in 10,000 years' time there'll be stuff handling all the pollutants. So if we know how that's going to happen, we could get a head start on it and start doing that ourselves.
Interesting idea.
It is an interesting idea. I don't know anything about AI, but I do work with an engineering firm that uses AI a lot, machine learning, to improve modeling, and that is an obvious thing. There's also really interesting large-scale surveillance and monitoring, things like Global Fish Watch, which looks at vessel behavior at sea, and can determine whether there's illegal fishing going on, and that requires, a lot of big data that is crunched by artificial intelligence. So there's an endless array of things I think we could harness AI for. I couldn't begin to think about it.
Indeed. Just going to pick out a few bits and pieces. One person pointing out that Canada is very big on anti-pollution, has been working a lot in anti-marine pollution there, investing quite a bit. Also, somebody mentioning blueventures.org, Coastal and Coral Reef Conservation Organisation, working in Southeast Madagascar, who are also linking in to the population and health and environment side of things. Somebody asking what are the effects of huge ocean liners and cruise ships on the oceans? Should they be made to ameliorate the pollutants they produce? And it occurred to me, I know that one of the things that seems to be going on in the marine travel and shipping area is a sense that they are on borrowed time as far as fossil fuels go. So I know there are moves to try and find alternative fuels, which surely will help the oceans as well. Is there anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer. Years ago, I was in a brainstorming with a bunch of people who were looking at tourism and tourism impacts, and we, after many kind of, I won't call them fights, but there were some heated debates. We were thinking about the impact of cruise ship expansion, because all of the cruise ship, when we're talking about mega cruise ships, not the small cruise ships, because I think that's a different thing altogether, and I think the small cruise ships probably serve a very important role of connecting people to the ocean. And many of those are run very sustainably and are low impact, and they really focus on the sea, as opposed to these big cruise ships, which replicate Disney World on the ship, and you might as well not be on the ocean. I think, you know, there's very little kind of connection with the sea. But one thing we were talking about, and this is 1980, so a long time ago, was is it actually better to put people on big ships? If you're going to have this kind of mass tourism that has no connection with the sea and with a place, is it better to put them on a ship and contain them and process the waste and, you know, try to sustainably feed these people and control their behavior, rather than contributing to coastal development and more habitat loss? So if, you know, and so it's this balancing act. If you don't have these hundreds of thousands of people going to sea, are there enough hotels to accommodate this kind of tourist, right? It's a mass tourism thing. It's the people who are happy to swim in a chlorinated swimming pool in a beautiful place in coastal Mexico and never see this where they are, and just, you know, drink pina coladas and swim in the pool and then go home. So we had this debate, and I think most people are saying it'd be better to develop the coast sustainably and carefully and get rid of the cruise ships, but I'm not really sure. And, you know, most cruise ship operators are obliged to treat their waste. Many of them cheat, but they're being very carefully watched. And they are moving towards sustainable fuels. Some of the big cruise ships are now being built with sails so that they have some sail power that assists. They can't be fully under sail.
And somebody in the talk said they're starting to look at hydrogen generation from ammonia, which you can store fairly effectively, fairly efficiently, and then generate hydrogen on board to actually propel the ship. So, yeah. Interesting. I am going to bring it to an end in terms of the discussion. There's a reason, because regulars will know you have a limited time to pack up and get out of the building before it locks up. And if you remember, we did the word cloud earlier. Yeah. So I'm just going to bring it back up again. So there's two. The first one I've already put into the right place. There we go. So if I just share a screen.
Oh,
I don't think that, can that be seen? Can you use the iPad to show it, yeah? So that was the first one. So we've got life in the middle, equilibrium, environmental sink, beauty, cool water, fish, sustenance, diving, swimming, tide, noises, and entertainment. What else have we got? A few repetitions there. So there's quite a lot of that. And then if I just go to my email, just give me a sec. Where am I? There. Have you sent the other one, Kia? She's just going to do it now. Give me a sec. Hang on, I just have to redo. This is where it'll make me log in again. There we go. There's the other one. So that's what we've got now. That's interesting. That's quite a change, isn't it? We're all very optimistic. This is, yeah.
Wow. Well, it's...
I'll send you those, Tundi.
Yeah, so life figures so prominently, both before and
it does,
after, and
yeah.
that's fantastic. And maybe you didn't need me to tell you already, so...
I think it's interesting, though, that that's more nuanced. There's more different ways in which we see the interaction.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Oh, I would love to...
I'll give you those.
Yeah, get those.
I'll also
it's
put them up
fantastic.
on
Thank you
the
so
video.
much for doing that, because it's really interesting to see. Yeah.
So that's all the thoughts of everybody online as well. So it's quite a busy day on the chat. Really nice experiment to try. Thank you for encouraging us to do it. And thank you very much to Kelly for actually putting the art together, because that was fabulous. And our biggest thank you, of course, as ever, to our speaker, Tundi.
Oh, well, thank you so much for...